Hello, everyone. Hello. Hello. Welcome to Cybersalon. So tonight we'll be talking about games for social good. I'm Rosa. I run Games for the Many. We made the game Corbin Run. Who here has played Corbin Run? Oh no, not enough of you. Okay. So Corbin Run was a game we made during the general election. In it, you play as Jeremy Corbyn chasing down tax dodgers. And when you catch them, you take the money that they stole, and then you launch manifesto pledges, which means that people join you in the fight. And yeah, we launched that during the general election, and we got 150,000 downloads in the first week. So yay. See, I've been wondering, like, art has been historically very political, so why is it that games almost like shy away from the political context that they're created in? Let alone address political issues. They're a powerful tool, 2.2 billion players, as you've seen on the event page, it said. And in the wider context, we still seem to be shaking off like bad misconceptions about games. The World Health Organization just released a report at the end, like at the turn of this new year, saying that they cause addiction. It's like, thanks guys, causing more problems for us. And I get asked constantly if they are still, if games are just trivial, they're just entertainment. But I don't think they are trivial. And the games industry, particularly the indie scene, is very hungry to make an impact with their games. So what we're trying to do at Games for the Many is to build that platform where indie developers can make political games and try to make an impact. So tonight we have a strong lineup of people doing just that. They're making games to try and have an impact in the world. So first off, we have Amanda Warner. She designs and develops games that focus on real-world change. So last March, she launched Fake It to Make It, a social impact game about how fake news is created and being distributed. It has been played more than 90,000 times by users in 170 countries. She's designed games for NGOs and charities, and particularly targets medical care, disaster response, and financial services in developing countries. She's going to be Skyping in from the US, and I think Simon's just setting up. Is she here?
Hello, can you hear me? I can hear myself, so yay.
Yay! Hello, Amanda.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, are we ready?
Yes.
Yes, we are.
Okay, perfect. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So, hey everyone, yay, I'm glad we're finally connected. As Rosa said earlier, I'm Amanda, and I'm a learning and game designer. And so today I'm going to talk about Fake It to Make It, which is a browser-based game that I launched in March of last year. So I'm going to walk through my motivations and early design process for creating this game, and then I will open it up for questions or feedback or whatever you would like to discuss. So I made this game because I was depressed about the 2016 presidential election in the United States. And maybe there was a lot to be depressed about. But one thing that I was very specifically depressed about was the amount of false information that I saw swirling around on the internet leading up to the election. So I knew I wanted to do something, but I wanted to think closely about what it was that I was trying to accomplish. I spread false information for lots of reasons. Sometimes people might know or suspect that something isn't true, and they might spread it anyway for various reasons. And these weren't the people that I wanted to target, because that's a whole different set of problems. So I really wanted to target the people who genuinely believe that these fake articles were legitimate. So essentially, I wanted people to employ a higher level of skepticism when reading potentially misleading articles. I also wanted them to notice when a claim is questionable and fact-check it. Because I'm ambitious, I also wanted people to explain to others why and how fake news is distributed, and maybe even become advocates in stemming the spread of misinformation. So essentially, when someone saw a misleading article on Uncle Herbert's Facebook feed, I wanted them to be able to fact check it. I definitely didn't want them to spread it. And ideally, I'd even like them to post a comment explaining why it's misleading. Maybe not for the sake of Uncle Herbert, but for everyone else who might see it. So my next question was, why wasn't this happening already? Well, why do people think that certain fake stories are legitimate? So first, maybe they don't understand how easy it is for an individual with a little bit of tech skills to register a domain name and create a website. Many of the fake news sites that are out there are run on WordPress-like templates, and they aren't really that challenging to set up. Same honestly with the writing of the articles themselves. So if someone sees an article that has quotes from people, it has images, it has specific details, they might think that this is real because they don't understand that this is all, again, very easy to fake. So that you know this is a fake article, even though it has an image, so don't believe it. And finally, people don't necessarily understand the financial incentives that are out there for creating fake news, mainly through ad revenue. So I wanted them to understand the profitability, especially for people who are living in areas that have lower cost of living than the United States. So how can I do all this? So this is an outcome map. With it, I start out with the high-level outcomes that I want to achieve in the world, and then I try to figure out what else needs to happen in order to support these outcomes. So here you can see I started out with the 2 higher-level goals that we looked at before, and then I mapped out some additional items below it. So to support these goals, people also need to believe that fake news does exist. They need to understand the financial incentives for creating fake news. That you need to understand how it's written and distributed. And they need to be able to identify some of the sort of common techniques that are used. So things like writing articles that make people scared or angry, including partial truths, that sort of thing. So I engage in more traditional learning design as well, and I use outcome maps for most of my projects. I think it's a great way to make sure that what you're asking people to do in the game or training actually supports what you want them to do in the real world. And so while I had lofty ambitions here with my 2 top-level goals, I also think it's important to be realistic. I realized I probably couldn't achieve everything that's shown here, and so I focused on these items in blue. So these really involve understanding fake news as a system and being able to identify how it's written. So looking at these, I wondered, what's the best way for people to gain a deep understanding of how and why fake news is distributed? So my background is in training and learning, and often when we design learning, it's like we're sort of imagining it to be like this photo. So we imagine that someone's going to read something or listen to it, and poof, it's going to be embedded in their brain, ready for the real world. But the problem is that reading and listening is generally not enough for long-term retention, let alone for skill development or for behavior change. And so I rejected a more traditional training approach. I began exploring a more interactive, experiential format, like a game. But what type of game? So this type of game is very popular in the training world. But my issue with games like Jeopardy is that selecting questions that are worth a certain amount of money probably has very little to do with the message you're trying to convey. So depending on how you wording your questions, they might help people memorize or review some basic facts, but the game structure itself has very little to do with your message, unless your message is how to participate in quiz shows. So in most cases, I think you can do better. Similarly, in a lot of kids' learning games on the internet, the challenge is not particularly connected to the learning goals. So for example, in this game, the challenge is moving this guy up and down on the screen to collect letters. As you're doing this, incidentally, you will make some words. However, the challenge is focused on collecting stuff and not on actually thinking about letters or words or literacy. And I'm definitely not saying that games like this are awful. My 5-year-old loves games like this. But I think that in many cases, we can do better. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going down the rabbit hole of arguing about what a game is or what a game isn't. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to talk about the type of game that has a goal with a defined set of rules that limit how you can reach that goal. So as an example, think about golf. So your goal in golf is to get a ball into a hole, but you're not allowed to just walk up and put the ball into the hole. Instead, you have to hit the ball with a stick from some distance away, and there's often stuff in the way, like sand traps and water. And there are skills and strategies that people learn so they're better at efficiently hitting that ball into that hole. Golf. But even without much golf knowledge, I understand it would be a lot easier to just drop the ball into the hole. But even so, people are willing to spend a long time struggling and practicing and learning strategies and developing skills to work within the rules of the game. So this ability to motivate people to struggle is a super powerful aspect of games. So I'd argue pretty strongly that if your goal is to change something in your players, that you should integrate the message or the skills into the game mechanics. So that way your players are going to be struggling with and learning about those items throughout their whole experience. So players will spend lots of time trying to perfect winning strategies, really crazy amounts of time. And because they've been struggling, they're more likely to remember what they've been struggling with. Okay, back to fake news, no more golf. So how can I take these items in blue and integrate them into the mechanics of a game? So I wanted to make the item in the blue boxes the same items the player is struggling with. So I decided to have the player make fake news. So if the player's goal is to make money by creating fake news, well, then they're going to understand the financial incentives. If they write their own articles, then yeah, they're going to get practice appealing to emotions and using partial truths. If they're picking sympathetic groups to spread articles to, then they're going to understand confirmation bias. So for this game, I've woven all of the items that I want to achieve into the game goal and into the mechanics. So I'm going to show you sort of how this specifically plays out in the game. I'm not going to attempt to demo it because disaster will happen, but I am going to quickly walk through some of the screens from the final game, and is also freely available online. So if anyone wants to afterwards, you can go and play it and have the experience yourself. So many of the people who make fake news for people in the United States actually live outside of the United States, in areas where the cost of living is much lower and money earned through internet ads goes a lot farther. So many of the sites that were targeting the US during the presidential election were actually run from Macedonia by people who don't really care about the election. They didn't want Trump to get elected exactly, but they just saw an opportunity to profit by spreading pro-Trump, in most cases, articles. So this seemed really useful for people to understand in support of the understand the financial impact objective. So I set up the storyline of this game as if players are Macedonian teenagers, so with a relatively modest financial goal. So something like buying music equipment, putting down a deposit for your apartment, or getting a used car. So players, after they pick their goal, they start setting up their first site, and they're introduced to the idea that they're going to be profiting from ad revenue. So at the beginning of the game, players build their sites by copying articles from other fake news sites. This is something that absolutely really happens. They then take them and they distribute them to social media groups using fake or purchased user accounts. So again, this is something that happens. I wanted people to gain sort of an idea of this system of fake news and how it actually works in the back end. So players see the results of their planted articles, both through fictional user comments and the number of shares, likes, and views that their article receives. And as they're playing, they have relative freedom to create the types of sites and the articles they would like. So you could just post articles about like cute cats if you wanted to. However, there's a series of intermediate goals and financial incentives that really nudge you towards creating politically divided sites, selecting articles that are inspiring fear and anger, and then distributing these articles to the politically sympathetic groups. And again, all of this is real world based. This is in the real world what makes people money. So after completing several intermediate goals, so players unlock the ability to write their own articles. So using this interface, they're introduced to some of these techniques, like including photos of a different event, quoting fictional people, including partial truths. And so really, they get a sense here of all the pieces that can go into these fake articles. And with this, I'm hoping that if they better understand these techniques at a high level, that they're going to be more likely to be skeptical when they see articles in the real world. So maybe if they see an article that has an image, perhaps they're going to be suspicious enough of it to reverse Google image search and learn that it's actually from a completely different event. So while the game is mostly about fake news as a system, instead of the impact of fake news, I tried to touch a little bit on the impact in the feedback, especially towards the end of the game. So for example, if you as a player have a highly successful article with the topic certain people are dangerous or immigration is dangerous, you may eventually receive a message saying that hate crimes have gone up against this group. Okay, so that's all I'm going to demo, I guess, show for now from the game itself, but it is available to play. I want to talk just a little bit about impact. And so I had all these goals, and so did I meet them? Was it successful? And I think this is a really important question to ask for all social impact games. The game is available freely online, and I think since Rosa was saying, since its launch, it's been played more than 90,000 times by users in 170 different countries. But for most of these players, I don't really know what they think or do after playing the game. However, I do periodically have people write to me. Most often, these are teachers who are using the game in their classrooms. And from what I hear from them, playing has really been a great way for their students to gain a much better understanding of how fake news is created and distributed. It's also sparked apparently a lot of great classroom conversations about the topic and digital literacy and what to believe on the internet. So I would love to partner with someone to more formally measure the impact of the game, but it hasn't happened so far. So what I have are these stories from teachers. So you can play the game either in English or in German using the URLs here. Based on what I've talked about now, I would love to just open it up for questions or thoughts. I welcome feedback on the game itself if you have any thoughts.
Yeah. We'll do the questions afterwards, that's okay.
Okay, questions afterwards. Cool.
All right, thank you so much, Amanda.
Let's go.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So we're going to go with Rich. He's one of the forces behind Off Grid, which is a game about hacking. And you use data as your tool to hack people. It follows real-world events surrounding data privacy, and the gameplay utilizes unique mechanics that allow you to manipulate the world and people around you with the data that they unwillingly leave behind.
You just have to give me 1 sec as well to plug my laptop in.
So Rosa is running game jams, so maybe we have a minute while Rich is setting up. You have to say what's the next one.
So we're running a game jam here this weekend, and I think they're a great way for people aspiring to become game developers to try it out. Game jams are about getting lots of people together in one space, and they have, in this case, 48 hours to make a game. So you form teams, and together you make a game, and at the end of Sunday, because this is a weekend game jam, you have a game, and that's something that you can then show and have in a portfolio. We're running one here at Newspeak House this weekend. We're running one in Manchester.
Do you still have spaces for the weekend?
The weekend one a bit tight, but we're running one in Manchester and one in Bristol, and I tend to run quite a few. There's going to be another one potentially this summer, which is a copy of the Slow Game Jam, which I ran last year. And that was a game jam exploring how we could make games which are about relaxing, calming down, using mechanics which aren't just, running around and shooting. So you're all welcome to come to that and see what's up.
Cool. Hi. My name's Rich, Rich Metzen. Yes, I'm one of a small motley crew of indie devs making a game called Off Grid, which is it's a video game about data privacy primarily. In fact, that's how we started out making it. Instead of really focusing on hacking, which emerged as one of the things that we wanted to explore, data privacy was where we started off. And the reason we started making a game of this style was we tried to think through how would you go about creating a game about data privacy. Privacy is about trying to hide things, and the biggest genre for hiding things is stealth. So we decided to make a stealth game where you had to hide your data. In the game, you play a technophobe dad who is completely useless with any technology, and he relies on his daughter, who may be up to some kind of shenanigans on a hacktivist level. It actually turns out it's your birthday at the beginning of the game, and she gives you a set of new kind of AR-style glasses. Those glasses, she's flashed the firmware and put an OS that's open source on them so that you can connect your phone. And she tries to guide you through it, but you come across all kinds of errors and hiccups, and she has to actually help you to get it up and running. So as as you start to sort of explore this idea of a pair of glasses that have your apps on, you say thanks to your daughter, and then in come the forces that be and whip her away. We've got a bit of an audio bug, so I'll skip through this. But yeah, that's the basic premise. It turns out that your daughter Jen is a hacktivist. Her crew of hackers have all been simultaneously raided at the same time, and they've all been got apart from one who has gone on the run, and he gets in touch with you to try and get you to resolve what the kind of what the conspiracy behind their arrests might have been. So this drops you a bit. It's a bit dark here, but this drops you kind of a bit later into the game. You have this kind of crypto chat window where it's kind of like Signal. You're able to kind of find compatriots and characters that you want to communicate with throughout the game and exchange keys with them, PGP keys, so that you can have encrypted conversations. And that's how much of the kind of game narrative evolves. On top of that, the way that characters' conversations are created is all written up in Lua, and actually most of the game logic is. So the game is entirely moddable. Anyone can write a branching conversation for the game with the files that the game has in it. So you download a copy of Off Grid, and you have open access to the Lua files to rewrite your own narrative if you want to. And that was kind of a key thing for us with Off Grid. Was from the get-go, we didn't want to be telling a prescribed story about how we felt about hacktivism or data privacy or whatever else. We wanted it to be something that a community could contribute to a conversation about. So that was where we were coming from. So yeah, this is the basic premise for the game. You get set up with a set of tools that this hacker contact has helped you set up on your glasses, and they are essentially, they give you the ability to view the data in the world around you. So all these kind of data points here are being procedurally generated by the AI, and they kind of pertain to the personalities and behaviors of those characters. You can go through the levels and essentially hack different characters and different devices to collect more data about different people. So in this instance, we actually knew ahead of time that this guard was asleep because you could read his text messages from outside of the level. But it goes a little further than that in that every time you pick up a piece of data belonging to a character, you start to build a profile of them, and you have like a profiler app that helps you to crack their passwords and things along those lines. So you kind of start to do semi-malicious things in the game world in order to kind of do the worthy thing of trying to get your daughter back. So you learn all these naughty things and you use them for a good goal. So yeah. I mean, in terms of sort of how much time, I think we were just going to give a brief overview, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I'm going to be demoing the game afterwards, and we can there'll hopefully be a few questions during the panel that I can answer that elaborate on it all a bit more. But yeah, you have this set of apps down the bottom. That's the other kind of main thing, and you can essentially hack into multiple Internet of Things connected devices. Although at the minute with the keyboard and not the controller, I'm having a little bit of a hard time demoing it perfectly to you. So yeah, the idea behind the game was essentially to make something that would explore data privacy, and as we started to build it, we started to actually get more into hacker ethics and the politics around how young people who embrace technology and maybe trip over and go into those grey areas start to become persecuted. And so we've kind of evolved a story that looks at technology from the perspective of a technophobe who's trying to understand the political impact it has. So yeah. Release date. So sometime this year, towards the end of this year is our tentative. But yeah, we're getting very close now.
You can imagine it.
Next is Ben Greenway. He does a lot of charity development work and has worked with Big Issue, Here Today, and many non-for-profit NGOs and digital charity campaigns. He is Cybersalon's games reviewer and has a lifelong interest in games for good.
Hi, evening. Just another technical rejiggering, hopefully one that shouldn't take too long. Okay, we have some audio. Groovy. Right. So, yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Rosa. Yeah, as Rosa mentioned in the introduction, I'm not actually a games developer. I've spent a good chunk of my 10, 15 year odd out of that time, I think, developing web applications, mobile apps. I've had one or two, actually two small game projects in that time. But one thing I specifically haven't done is develop this game. So I'm really here as an advocate for it, I suppose, certainly as a games reviewer, an interested consumer of this game. And I think there's a couple of things that turn up in this project. I call it a project more so than a game, because I've certainly lived with this as an Indiegogo project, as a series of blog stories, as a conversation about how simulation works or doesn't work. Far more than I've lived with it as a game. In fact, it only became available as a game right at the end of last year. It's in what's known as Steam's early access, what once was called Greenlight projects. If those of you that are games devs probably know about this kind of stuff, those of you that don't worry, I'll get to that part towards the end of the slides. Riot Civil Unrest is the title of the game, and it is a riot simulator for PC and Mac, console, iOS and Android, allegedly to come at some future date. But the PC and the Mac versions are out, so quite good fun. And what do you do in a riot simulator? You basically take control of either the rioters or the police. You play a small-scale, it's kind of like a real-time strategy game. So you are the strategist for the police, or you are the strategist for the rioters. You click on the tool you would like them to make use of, rocks, social media alerts, batons, whatever it is, and then you left-click somewhere else in the environment. You say, put those people over there, make them take photographs and post it to social media, and so on and so forth. Lots of things got me interested about this, not just the political issues that it wanted to address, but as an engineer, it really got me interested in how on earth it was going to make that happen. You know, there's an agency issue in games. First-person perspective games where you play the character, agency is quite immediate. You are doing what you're doing, you see what happens straight away. Games where there's a layer of AI or maybe a layer of separation, just even in representation, so 2D versus 3D, or narrative steps rather than interactions. It can be a little bit hard, and I often find real-time strategy games have a problem there. So how was it going to actually feel like I was in a riot? Or how was it actually going to feel like I was defending the state from these evil children? And that was the question that I was interested in. How are they going to make the model work? And those of you who've done, has anybody done any modeling software type stuff in the room? So what we mean by a model is quite interesting. A model is actually going to do things. Your model is your AI, so to speak, right? And it computes reactions to each input for each game character. It doesn't just say, if the police are scared, then they run with batons. It doesn't just say, if the rioters are excited, then they throw rocks. Each rioter has his own set of characters and variables. Each rioter has a fear level, an excitement level, a nervousness, a series of tools. And the model's doing quite a complex job. So if there are 50 police officers and 200 rioters, you've got 200 separate calculations on one side going on and 50 more on the other level. And the games devs that went after this went after that at that level of detail. And I thought, okay, this might be interesting. You then, as I said, get to give direction to that group, but if it's too stressful a situation, some might be too scared to carry out your instructions. They might run away, others might be more gung-ho than you've told them to. So there's that sort of friction between intent and reality that, if anybody's actually attended a large-scale demonstration, know all too well. So let me just have a quick look at what it actually looks like. The developers for this, their history with the game really started from attending or being involved in events of this sort. A particular one, the No-Tav events in 2005 in northern Italy. So this is the game trailer. There's a bit of audio running. This is the trailer of the early access release. And so little pixel art type characters, each of which, as I say, is fully modeled by the system. So they have like emergent behavior and crowd dynamics as you start to play. The sound design is great. Glass shattering, crowds cheering. Yeah, really, really big scenes. Lots and lots of different characters in there. So that's exciting, right? Yeah. And Leonard Manchari, the initial designer, was like, well, to be honest with you, it did actually come out of his personal experiences. And so for him, much like our previous speaker, the game is produced in order to, as a response really, to a real-world series of events. It's there to give testimony to what he experienced that wasn't really being reported as he understood it in the press in the way that he would like it to be, wasn't as widely understood or widely discussed as he wanted it to be. So, what can we do? Well, we're games developers, we know how to write software, we know how to get software published, let's have a go at that. And that was way back in 2011, I think, when they first started speccing this. This is a fantastic blog post of his on GameSpot from around 2011. Talks about the riot that he was at and what actually happened, how shocking it was for him to be at that. In that, 2 years later, March 2013, the project went on to Indiegogo. That's when I first became aware of it. Raised $25,000 from 2,000 backers. So what's that? 10, 15 pound donations, something like that. Enough to get the game green lighted for themselves. It took a heck of a lot of time to get any further. So, if you have a piece of passion, you have to work at it. But Riot then, say after that funding, there was another funding round, but it wasn't crowdfunded. I think they did find some financial backers. They finished off the game engine, finished off the software and the art design, and went into what's called Steam Early Access at the end of last year. Planned release later this year. So what goes on? What happens in Riot? Well, there's 4 scenarios, 4 real-world historic events that they wanted to treat, or really that they've used to base their scenarios on. So we have the No TAV, which is the transportation program happening in Italy, big demonstrations there. The Battle of Karatea in Greece, which was a, hopefully pronounced that well enough, a moment when Athens thought, you know what, we're going to dump all of our trash just down the road over there, and that town's not going to mind. Well, apparently that town did mind, and they minded quite a lot. They have used a lot of the M15, the movement in Spain, to key off some of that kind of work as well. And the last project they wanted to do was the Tahrir Square events as well. Okay. Gameplay looks kind of like that at the moment. This is a screenshot I grabbed a couple of days ago. So as you can see, it looks quite busy at this level. It's quite hard to work out what's going on. So you can zoom in. Each of these pixel pieces of chaos is a protester of some sort or another. These protesters are obviously going to defend that central square. Coming in from your right there is a series of gendarmes. I was actually playing as a gendarme at that point, so I was giving them instructions, and my job was to evict all the protesters from this particular square. I'm not sure if I succeeded, and I'm not sure what the injury rate was. But if you've ever played a real-time strategy game, you'll kind of get what that interface is telling you. Yeah, you pick some of the possible series of commands in the top right-hand corner there, and have a goal. They have a time limit for each goal. And at the end of the goal, at the end of that particular event, you get a little scorecard like this. This is actually quite clever. I'll unpack a couple of things here. You're not just getting a who's won, even though this was clearly a rebel's victory. Is it why was it a rebel's victory? Well, because there was a negative political result on the police and a positive military result on the rebels, i.e. they did keep the square, or they did keep the camp, or they did occupy the space, depending on whichever level this one was for. If you notice my rebels in this particular thing, I think I was playing rebels here, we didn't go out to capture any policemen, we didn't wound any or kill any, we didn't cause any property damage. We might have. You can, if you wish. But equally, the police destroyed quite a lot of stuff. and they got a few injuries or something. But that's kind of how it works. Then it produces a kind of like a fake newspaper report for the following day for you. And in the first few times you play through, you kind of get this idea. It's like, okay, I've got a very targeted goal to achieve in a 10, 15-minute piece of gameplay. You either succeed or don't succeed. You're either scored on how aggressive or weakly you accomplish that goal. As I said, you're playing either as the activists, and the activist setup, you can sort of configure a few elements, like what kind of tools should you take with you. At the time, I've got a megaphone and my social media contacts. I can also pick things like firecrackers, fireworks. There's a particular gas that helps. I'm sure some of you here would know. There's a gas that helps deaden the effects of tear gas. You can grab a few canisters of that. Molotov cocktails is an option. It's a different kind of party when you take those, obviously. But things like the offensive gear, how equipped would you like your rioters? Are they in casual dress? In which case you're going to be looking at a couple of hundred people you can get hold of. If you need them in battle-ready gear, you know, visors, motorcycle helmets, leather jackets, the number of people you can call on drops down sort of below 100. So the strategy is baked in to the setup as well. And equally in the police, you actually, if you're playing on the police's side, you have more like a fixed budget, and you can afford tactical units, or you can afford arrest units, or you can afford defensive units. And again, depending on what it is you're going into, you get a chance to empathize and play out their scenarios. But this is what interested me the most when you talk about a simulation tool, is that how can I do a simulation? How can I have player agency in a historical event? Right? I mean, one of the funniest things for me is the historical reenactment. And I don't mean to insult anybody on that, but you kind of know what's going to happen. And I'm sure that's part of the fun for historical reenactment. So, we're going to go out and, you know, we're going to take on the Roundheads today. So what's going to happen? Oh, we know. And then we're going to have a beer. That's great. But in a game like this, surely that's going to get as dull as I would expect. And so that was really interesting to me. When it finally reached playable state at the end of last year, I jumped straight in with 2 feet and said, okay, what's going to happen? How's it going to play out? Spoilers. I'm not going to tell you how it plays out. More what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what they've done in terms of simulation, or maybe this kind of idea that we're talking about where it's a halfway between reenactment and simulation. You might think, well, am I reenacting the weather when I model it and see what happens if I run it forward with a few variations? Yeah, so that's what's happening. So things like, you know, his original interest in the riots that he attended formed his understanding of the model, formed his understanding of how people might behave, or what tools might be brought to bear, what forces might be present at one of these events. And that's really how he's gone after it. So lots of historical stuff. So for instance, this particular guy, who, I don't know if you've had a chance to read these notes, but this guy turned up at an event, the Chilean demonstrations in 2011. He was among one of the protesters. So they baked him into the game, which is quite nice. He got a particularly aggressive Santa Claus. He just turns up. He might be in your level, he might not, but he's in there having a thoroughly good go. Equally, this woman, Wonder Woman, as she was known by her other colleagues in events like this, and this was at the Venezuela protest just last year. They turned particularly nasty. The story of this is not great, but this particular lady had a big Instagram page, big Instagram following as a fitness instructor. So the fact that she then turned up in photographs on the day at this riot triggered a particular kind of interaction with the press, one that's actually also baked into the game, so protesters might want to take photographs of the police at a particularly key moment and post that, and that is a mechanic you can use. So goading the police into doing something, taking a photo, tweeting it out, and then everybody rushing back and seeing if you can get more people in. Caterina Cielozzi, Wonder Woman, she was dubbed, and she's been baked into the game as well, so you might find her turning up in it. And the idea all the way through has been to take scenarios that we know and that we understand and get them into the game, or at least get the component mechanics of them in. What happens on any given playthrough, we don't know. So it isn't historic reenactment in that sense, okay? Fuzzy reenactment is what I want to think about, you know? And it's real-world rules-based. Any sufficiently complex model that's got real-world-like rules is useful on a scientific level to actually see what happens. You can imagine this game playing itself. hundreds of thousands of times and seeing, is there ever a winning rioters strategy, or is there ever a winning police strategy? And we're used to, as I said, we're used to simulations for training pilots. In fact, we want our pilots to go through simulators a lot before we put them anywhere near a real plane. We're used to simulations as experiments, where we actually learn things that become valuable in the real world. Protein folding, scientific testing actually now happens significantly in some places as simulation, as gameplay experimentation. And we had real discoveries out of that. And then also the one that you'll probably all be familiar with, the simulation as prediction, is that I kind of know the physics model of the real world here. I sort of know how heat makes water turn into cloud, and how cold makes cloud turn into rain. So I could effectively guess, based on current predictions, what my weather will be like in 2 or 3 days. So all of these things make this a riot simulator to me, and I think it gives it value for that alone. So what's the takeaways from this talk? So I'm saying that we talked about gaming for social change. Well, yeah, but also social change is gaming, right? It isn't just about, you know, going out and playing. It's about social change and then its effects. This is very clearly one of the latter. It's documenting and offering new perspectives. I think they've done a good job in not just sitting there saying, fight the power. But there's quite an interesting sympathy story, particularly in that blog, of what happens when you are up against the front line and you've been chatting with the police and you've been there for hours and you're like, this is going to work. Okay. And then they get called and it's like, get rid of those police, bring in some more police. And that's when the nasty stuff happens. So these 2 last points, simulation games you may already know, they have their own value. They have quite a good history. We do know how to play those games. And I think I put this in because this made sense to me. We practice, gamers practice. I will do something twice, or 3 times, or 4 times, or 5 times to get a better outcome. And there's only so many times I actually want to face down a mounted police officer screaming down Hyde Park. And it's 1, and I've done that already. But I did learn a lot about the way these kind of organizations can happen. So is it a game you should play? Is it a good game? Well, it's still in early access, so it still hasn't officially been released. You can buy it. You can spend £9.99 and have yourself a copy of this game that is still being developed. There aren't that many bugs, but there are issues to be developed. So when it first came out live, there was no trainer. The trainer level's been added, that's great. There's some discussion at the moment as to whether the keyboard, the interactions are as simple as they might be. I would expect that will change. There's some conversation too about how quickly the difficulty ramps up. It's actually not interesting enough until you get at least halfway through, until it gets quite hard, and then you actually have to think. So some of this will change, but at the end of the day, yeah, it's already good enough. £10, excuse me, £10, it'll probably be twice that when it eventually releases. It might not release for another couple of months, but if you want to play a really pretty pixel art, entertaining simulation of a riot, safe at home with your slippers on and a cup of tea, there you go. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Simon Sargensen. He has been investigating the visceral effects of digital in playful and political contexts. He is Cybersalon's creative technologist in residence. He has a long list of digital projects, and see what he has to say.
I work in the games industry, and I have some opinions. And I'm also tremendously inspired doing this presentation, as you can see by the title, Exploring Ideas in Games. So I want to talk about 3 different games which all have a bit of a different view on how we interact with government. So starting with the game on the left called Orwell. So in Orwell, you play an agent a la Snowden, and you are, as a contractor, embedded in some kind of surveillance system to investigate this woman here, inspired, with an inspirational name, Cassandra Watergate. And she turns up at a bombing site as a and she's been involved in protest, and she's had some police involvement, and you're tasked with investigating her. So you find out something about this woman. You first start off with investigating her through sort of social media, whatever is broadcast, and you map out her network. The point it's trying to make is obviously something about, you know, how public information makes you easily identifiable, which we all kind of know, but it kind of hammers home how easy it is and how uncomfortable it is to engage with that material. But actually, as you go on with the game, something interesting happens because you start to get more invasive and actually look into somebody's private chat logs and such. So two sort of interesting things happen in this game. One is you get kind of bored of looking through all these people's lives, and so not so interested. And that's actually kind of interesting because the game, being a game, has a goal, and the goal is to find the terrorist, ostensibly. And in order to move forward, you have to find clues to map out her network to actually capture her. So you start scan reading through all this stuff, looking for evidence that moves you forward. And that kind of reminds me of something, namely the motivation of an actual Snowden persona who looks for this information to find a culprit. So I think it's a very nice example where the game as a system aligns with the motivation of the subject it's trying to portray. The second thing that happens is that you start to notice that you have a lot of power. You sort of surface information, but a lot of this information is very ambiguous. As we can see here, we have this sort of gamey, conflicting information thing. On the one side, you smash somebody's skull in, but you did it to save somebody. You can only upload one of those two bits of information, which is it's a bit of a gamey thing, but it's there to illustrate that, people's lives are hugely ambiguous, and your choices in what you surface and how you connect the thread is actually quite important. And the idea is, so it sort of becomes a bit boring and you try to sort of just get from A to B as you do in a game. But also your goal sort of like, there's a tension there with the narrative itself. So the goal of the game and the goal of you as a player are at odds with this perception that you have that the game hammers home pretty hard that you're working for an evil government. And I would argue that games are especially good at creating this kind of uncomfortable tension. So rather than a sort of watcher from the outside, as you would be in any other form of art, you're actually participating, and your agency or your perceived agency in this makes that uncomfortable. Even though the game doesn't really leave that much up to ambiguity as to your role, you are plainly a sort of pawn of evil, as it were. And it doesn't really sort of give off the nuances of that. The following game does do that, which is Papers, Please. If you are into games and indie games at all, you'll probably have heard of this, but I try to sort of tailor my talk to both people who are experienced with the games and who aren't. So Papers, Please is a game, I'll probably move to the next slide to sort of illustrate it a little bit more. You are working as a border agent, and the game starts off with announcing you as a lottery winner to have a job, which already sort of impresses on you the situation that having a job is actually quite rare in this occasion. And what the game plays with is this tension, right? So on the one hand, you are a government employee working, and you see all these very sad stories passing in front of you. People who don't necessarily have the right papers, but who by turning away will get murdered in their home country. But you can see here, you have like savings and salary, and every time you let somebody through that wasn't supposed to be there, you get fined. And every time you get fined, you earn less money. And not only is that bad for you and your rent and your food and your heat, but it's also bad for your whole family. Not only your son and your wife, but also other family members, because they are not bringing in money. So you start to face horrible choices every day about whether you're going to do the moral thing but pay for it yourself. And again, like Orwell, it sort of hammers home that at some point it becomes super mundane. Like you're checking all these documents and you're seeing all this human drama, and at some point it just becomes numbers and you just want to get through it. Even the shocking event of terrorist attacks, which you sometimes see happen in the top screen, which seems shocking, at some point just become an annoyance as they cut your days short and you get paid less. Which, you know, again, sort of making you involved in the process of actually playing the game and trying to reach the end goal of actually keeping your family alive and getting to the end of the game, whatever that might be, nicely aligns with the goal of the protagonist and shows you in a very visceral way how people can be stuck in this situation, modeled after some anonymous East Bloc country. And then the last game I want to talk about came out like just 2 days ago, which is the Red Strings Club, which is a cyberpunk adventure set in the future, obviously modeled a little bit after Casablanca and Blade Runner and such. And in it, you mix drinks in order to influence people to tell you what you want. You're not allowed to leave your bar because of a leg condition, and everybody comes to you and you are an information broker and you influence them with drinks. Not entirely unlike the giant corporations which are trying to manipulate you. And the game sort of actively poses the question of what the difference is between social influence as practiced personally and more traditionally, and that of the artifice of something like advertising. And you know, in this set of games where certainly Orwell is very politically slanted, and Papers, Please is, you know, a bit more distantiated, this sort of asks the question of, you know, what is the role of influence in our lives and how much of it how much of it do we allow in our lives? And it does a wonderful job. I would recommend you play it. It definitely also has a bit of a transhumanist slant as you make various modules to make people more popular on social media, have no moral conscience, or become a sex object. And you sculpt them and then insert them in these naked people. So yeah, the main mechanics being bartending and sculpting, because why not? So these three games, they offer all a sort of a slightly different view on government. I picked these games specifically because you can buy them. They're all under £20. They're fairly accessible, not very deep games, but I think they're interesting and they all show a different way of engaging with the subject matter of how we deal with influence in government and such. And my hope is that you'll be interested enough to actually play one of these games and have a thought or two about how specifically games can be used to ask questions and maybe even provide answers in some of the sort of more political or other sort of big questions in life. That's it.
Thank you. So we're going to do a panel now, and if you guys have questions, remember to put them on Slido.
Yeah, so it's slido.com. Sorry, guys.
So while you're putting your questions on Slido, I'll start. My first question to you guys is, we see a lot of political engagement in other art forms. Why don't we see that much of it in games? Do you think that's going to change?
I should know an answer to this because I actually wrote a thesis on this that was published, which was why video games don't engage politically the same as other art forms. The easy answer is the age of them. When compared to film, we're kind of hitting apparently around about the kind of 1930s in terms of timeline. So we've got a long way to go before film actually started to be political. We're in terms of years and acceleration relatively doing quite well. But it's also because games come out of something inherently not political. You know, it's pure entertainment. The arcade. You know, people went to the arcade to spend quarters and to kind of disappear into something entirely different. So that kind of language around the kind of politics and the impact is something that's still in development, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, I still remember a time when parents, grandparents of mine thought that the beeping that was coming out of my room as a teenager was the kind of thing that was going to do damage to me long term in my life. And the premise there that, since computer games are art, well, since when? I mean, only recently would you get halfway through a conversation with someone who isn't actually a gamer on that premise. So I think it is early in the timeline, in that respect. I mean, one of the software engineers that I've been sort of following since I was literally 10, 12 years old is still producing games. And throughout that 30-year gaming history, he's not needed to address any political issues. No one's come to him with any larger demand than, can you make something that goes beep fast and keeps me smiling and entertained? So yeah, I think the pressure isn't yet there from us to say, hey, I need more from this game. I need you to address reality issues. It isn't just fantasy or escape anymore.
I don't know. I think it's a really complicated question with a lot of answers. I mean, I think one thing is I experienced that for some reason or another, the sort of reasoning power and sort of political will and game making skills don't seem to come together in one package quite yet. And I think when collaborations do happen, I think they're often mismatched or misunderstood in a way that gives the whole thing a sort of an edutainment game vibe, and not in the most positive way. I think also the financial incentives, especially for games that have big impacts, are not really super well positioned to sort of have an independent voice, especially if you look at books, it's super independent, but even the movie industry, which while quite large and sort of organizational, it's certainly more independent. And I don't know, you need sort of scale to have the political message, and I'm not sure how that combines in the current ecosphere.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Is there a way that we can speed up that process? So if we are in the 1930s, is there a way we can accelerate?
Make better cameras.
Make better cameras.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, Unity Engine has actually probably, although it was never its intention, Unity Engine, the idea was it was going to democratize game development, but it didn't necessarily think that it was going to politicize game development. And I think it has, because it's so much easier to make a game now than it was 5 years ago. And especially 10 years ago, that people are picking up tool sets, buying plugins, having pre-set up libraries that they can deliver an interesting narrative through. And so the 1930s equivalent is like the Lumiere brothers were making their own cameras at the time. That's kind of where games was 5-10 years ago. So now that we're not making our own cameras, we are actually able to focus on political content more and make ourselves more independent in many ways. I mean, Unity, again, I sound like I'm a kind of poster boy for Unity all of a sudden, but the cost of it is so low that people do have an ability to enter the market and make something that can compete commercially, given enough time, and the time element is the next question, really, to that funding side.
Yeah. I pretty much echo all that. It is down to, I think a lot of it comes down to the tooling. I can't imagine any industry, let alone gaming, making a public more politically active or more politically engaged. I have no idea what would do that. What would motivate the demand for gamers to go, you know what, there's an untapped market in frustrated political discourse that we must release a blockbuster in. I can't see it happening that way now. So I think it will be more indies, access to the toolkit by a broader subset of the populace than just those who've professionally trained and been to a 5-year, 3-year university to get started.
Yeah.
I don't know, I think a lot of the times they try to do too much and try to sort of take a cue from movies in terms of focusing on the narrative content, but actually, what games makes games special is interaction. And actually, I think maybe we should be looking beyond like the confines of just like a game for fun and entertainment, because I'm not really sure like the mechanical pleasure that you derive from a game is always the most productive way of using interaction to expose political processes. So there's a number of projects that I've seen that have used some of the interactions that we sort of associate with games in a much looser form to expose interesting ways in which the political process works. And I think that frees you from a lot of the pressures that a game has, because, I don't know, like a book or even a film to a certain extent can afford to sort of not be fun at some level. If a game is not fun, then it's, you know, you're not going to touch it for more than 10 seconds.
I mean, that pushes the whole thing back into being harder to get entry level or newcomers into making something interesting though, right? Because the technical expertise, because it's almost touching on what Ben was saying about models, right? In some sense, like a simulation is how you really start to engage with an issue within a game. If there is something that's interestingly simulated and that you can tweak and change the outcome from. Whereas the knowledge required to write a really interesting model or an interesting simulation, it far outweighs that to write and not to bash on them at all, but a walking simulator, as they get termed, that delivers an interesting political story from a narrative perspective. So I think that kind of, we won't ever have tools that make it easier to make an amazing simulation, because you have to be there writing algorithms from the ground up.
It is hard.
Right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think also ultimately you want your experience to be holistic. So however sort of pre-boxed experiences you have with whatever shiny new engine is going to come in the future, ultimately, you know, it is a goal that, you know, in some of the games I've shown, I think quite sort of extraordinarily and quite rarely, there is some cases in which you can align the mechanics of the game with the outcome that you want, or the sort of the art that you want to produce. But I think that's quite difficult and quite rare to sort of find those cases.
So, Amanda, do you catch the question, or?
No, not at all. I am not hearing the questions or the conversation. Okay. I hear that there are questions in the conversation, but I can't hear any of the specifics.
Okay, I'll repeat then. So, we were talking about how do we speed up the process of getting games to be a bit more political? And we mentioned that perhaps tools would be like making it easier to make games so other people can get involved as a way to speed up the process. But then we ended up talking a little bit about how games might be a difficult medium to marry politics and games because it's hard to express politics through mechanics, and not everyone can create a simulation. So how do you think we can speed up the process of getting more political games? Oh, no? Are you there?
Someone puts on his other hat.
Amanda? Okay, so we've lost her again. Okay, so moving on. Okay. So how can we motivate developers to make political games then? How do we get them to do it? Like the ones that already know how to use the tools.
Game jams is great for it. I mean, you know, the fact that you guys are doing game jams around that kind of thing is brilliant, and I think the numbers of people engaging with that is growing. Like we mentioned in conversation earlier, Paolo Pedicini, who's Mol Industria on Twitter, and he makes lots of very interesting short games around politics of varying things, whether it's oil or drones or whatever else. But you know, those kinds of games can be made in jam situations. I got into games from the perspective of wanting to make environmental games. Well, got into making games from the perspective of wanting to make environmental games, or games that talked about environmental impacts 10 years ago, something like that. I think like the game jams that I organised around that kind of thing were just a really nice kind of melting pot for people to share ideas. People don't tend to complete game jam games. That's the problem.
No,
it's
that is
like
a problem.
you'll see lots of ideas, but like the next step would be how do you persuade people to finish their political games? And that's a money thing as well, right? Because games do take, probably a commercial game takes longer, a commercial indie game takes longer to make than a commercial indie film. And so the kind of staying power, it needs financial backing, and where does that come from?
Hopefully the Labour Party.
There's definitely value for the jams. There's something to the crowdfunding type story as well. And whilst I don't want to like come off saying that crowdfunding is just a panacea solution to all things, I want to grab the question slightly differently. It's like an almost challenge. Why is there a political game? If we are developing easier to use tools, if we are letting more people express themselves and their interest through building games or developing games technology, then I think it's a consequence, not a goal, it's a consequence of that games will become more political. I mean, like, we've all had, you know, present company, I can speak of, maybe yourself, I'm not sure, but gaming's trained us. We've had computer science degrees or mathematics degrees. We spent years in a gaming house or console building house developing code and writing code. So we're kind of, you know, for all of the ease of access to education, we've come from a particular and peculiar background, and we've suffered through similar political stories and social narratives. If you have a broader set of people contributing to gaming as a whole that didn't necessarily have to go through a computer science degree, but are able to contribute content to this field, then you're going to have different stories told. And then the classic example is you can take something as simple as Paperboy, which was an old 1980s game where you would cycle down the street throwing newspapers at it, which ostensibly isn't a political game at all, until Paperboy falls into a pothole in the street. You know, now it's like, oh, well, who fixes the street potholes? Yeah. So politics does come from everywhere. You know, it isn't necessarily, you might end up with more political games just because you've got more games. That's my point.
Yeah.
Right, we have some questions from Slido, which I've got here. I'll go from top rated to, yeah. How many questions shall we take, Rosa?
Five.
Five,
Yeah.
okay, right. So Luke asks, can we agree that the jury is still out on whether gaming has done long-term damage to Ben? Can you answer that?
Long-term, no. The jury is still out. I'm still too young
Okay.
to understand what long-term anything might
Good
be.
answer.
Okay, question.
Okay, why are societies more vulnerable people and never involved in the creation of games that are supposedly comment on their lives?
That's what I was trying to talk about.
I think there are some examples of that breaking through, and the title is completely escaping me, but there is a team making a game about the south side of Chicago at the minute that is meant to be trying to engage the community on a very kind of grassroots-led basis. Maturity of the medium, it's such a bad curtain to hide behind, but you know, when you are an indie developer and you've got no backing except for your mum who lets you move back into your bedroom at home, it's quite hard to find the resources to go out and research the communities hand in hand. You can do it quite well from the internet and try and explore things from, I mean, it's easy for me to say because I'm making a game about hacking and data privacy, all things that are explored in an online medium anyway. I think it's much harder to say when you're making something about the real world, the IRL world. But you know, the tool set does allow for people from more marginalised backgrounds to make games now, and we have some fantastic game designers out there who make things like Matty Bryce about their particular existences, whether it's being transgender or coming out, or so Nikki Case made a coming out simulator in a few years ago now. You know, there are people from marginalised communities making games, and I'm hoping it's an ever-growing thing.
Yeah, I would add to that a trend in the last 3 or 4 years, really just that this generation of consoles has been for user-contributed content inside AAA games. And I see that the user-contributed content, literally just feedback and posting and blogging about it, has the potential the same as it has in our other channels of social media. channels for conversations to get started, elements of which can sweep away a game or bring out a subgenre fairly quickly.
Yeah.
So, at that point you don't need any toolkit whatsoever to get involved. And a very minimal toolkit to get involved in projects that are still in development, from gamers maybe like ourselves or developers like ourselves that are sitting here saying, we recognize there's a problem and we need other input. Yeah. Not necessarily as engineers, but as early testers, ideation developers and things like that. So hopefully we'll get a broader...
Modders.
Modders, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons that we made the game moddable was knowing that there was no way I could explain hacker culture and people's perspective on data privacy and surveillance in Turkey as opposed to Brazil, as opposed to my experience in the UK. So very early on, when we were first funded, our first goal with our funding is to completely re-engineer our prototype so that the foundations of the code base would allow for us to make it moddable. And at that point, anyone who has access to our game, which will be perfectly affordable in the kind of line of the types of entertainment that are available to everyone, will be able to tell their own story from their own perspective. Making games moddable is a good answer to that, I think, as well.
Modder culture was a heck of a thing back when I was starting playing games as well.
Yeah,
the idea that a game would be something you could unpack and play with, that would be nice to see happen again.
Okay, one more question from Slido. How do we make non-left inclined people play the sort of games we saw tonight? Can there be a dialogue with makers of GTA, Last of Us, with the makers of GTA, Last of Us, etc., regarding politics?
You can have a go at them publicly. I did an interview with Eurogamer where I decided not to reel in about how I felt about Watch Dogs and how it dealt with the subject matter that we explore, which is hacker culture, in a really heavy-handed manner, in a way that I think is damaging to hackers who are being prosecuted across the world currently. So I think actually indie games, as they become more popular, indie games are not at their peak of popularity. I think they're becoming more of just people's games. And as we gain a wider audience who play a breadth of games, speaking up about when you think that something's a bit heavy-handed or doesn't deal with something in a particular way as a creator is a good way of voicing that concern, because then there's pressure on those studios to compete with you and to make something more important. Let's hope that Watch Dogs 3 is going to be more sensitive to the issues, I'd say.
Voices do matter. Has anybody played Star Wars Battlefront 2?
Yeah.
Yes. Lots of noise about that at the end of last year over the in-game payment system. It's a bit of a truism to say that your voice matters even against the big guys, but that's quite a good example of very bad planning on behalf of EA, who decided to set up a very potentially lucrative, in-game engine for you to buy additional content. They oversold on the promise of the game before release and the things that you would get in the £45 and £60 versions of this game that you would buy. And then there was literally uproar even before the game was released. In beta and on Reddit, they were screaming, and finally EA backed down. They said, you know what, we're going to put that whole mechanic on hold. And I think officially it's still on hold as opposed to abandoned. But the knock-on effect in the last few months about the conversation about in-app payments and micropayments has chimed with issues of gambling in the EU courts, and the ideas that digital gambling are actually equatable to the idea of paying for boxes of loot inside your game. So something that was just a bunch of annoyed gamers in a beta is now actively being debated in the European courts as to whether or not it should be illegal for these companies to produce their games after a particular fashion. Now, I don't say there's a direct correlation to every social ill or concern that a populace has. They will actually have legislation. But yeah, you do have a voice.
Yeah.
What did the Eurogamer do when you blew off?
Oh no, they loved it. I mean, luckily I had a journalist called Chris Trapsell interview me, who was right on my page, and it was he described actually that it was kind of like just the two of us being down the pub rather than having an interview. But I think that there is so much room for games like GTA to explore the depth of the worlds they seem to portray in absolute detail for everything else. All they need to know is that it's going to mean that they can sell more copies if they do. And it means that the more people buying Papers, Please, or the more people buying Orwell, or the more people buying games for the many games,
they're free.
Then the more people downloading those, then we will eventually see the big boys and girls track towards making things that are more in depth, because they'll have to, because they'll realise that they don't absolutely own the market in the way that they used to.
Yeah, that is not a change. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think we have to wrap it up, but thank you so much for coming.
For a couple of sponsors, so Hydro 66 and also Newspeak House, which is a club, and you can join it. So look up at the website, and it will be great to see you joining, because they've been very good for us, and they stimulate a lot of discussions that probably wouldn't happen otherwise. So, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Rosa, for sharing, and hopefully see you at the Game Jams.
Yay.